Well, we're on side B here. Let's fill up a little bit to make sure we're going.
I think we should
And
ask him if he's available Tuesday.
anyway, we were on some kind of a scouting trip out of little Hobson, Montana, and I guess had some packs and fishing poles together. But I said 4 or 5 of us. There might have been 5 or 6 of us. The oldest one, 14, maybe me, 12, being the youngest. But so a guy came along in a stake bed farm truck, and we piled into the back of it and drove out in the mountains and came to a place where was a kind of a level. We wouldn't know anybody that ever camped there. It was just a nice little level spot next to I guess you'd say a raging mountain stream. Beautiful raging mountain stream, actually, where it had come down over some rocks and pretty fast, and white water, and then came into one of these deep pools that you see where the river widens out sometime in the mountains. And
whereabouts was this again?
it was just out of, I don't know exactly. It was in the mountains out of Hobson, Montana.
Huh.
I could never find it again. Nobody would ever know now. They're all dead. They're gone. But anyway, they dumped us off there, and yeah, this wide pool. You know how pools do. They surge around, and they're so clear, and you can see to the bottom of them. And then maybe it's how far is it across from here to the bookcase? There, about that wide, 30 feet.
Sure.
And then narrowing down and going on down into down the mountain someplace below, and they dumped us off, and we put up our tents and stayed there for 3 or 4 nights. And each morning we'd wake up and we'd look under a rock or something. We'd find some bug or something to put on our hook, and we'd toss it in and catch as many trout as we felt like, and then we'd fry them, eat them for breakfast. It never occurred to us that we wouldn't catch any fish, or wouldn't be able to eat them. Every morning you'd go catch some fish and eat them.
Scouting in Montana.
Yeah, and after a while, the guy came back and got us in a stake bed truck and took us home, and that was Boy Scouting out of Hobson, Montana. Terrific kind, what a kind. We had a good time. A lot of fun. I don't know, I'll move out of Hobson for a while unless I think of something to go back there for. But
do you remember any of those kids that were with you?
Oh, yeah, it's Rollins. He wants to know if I remember these kids. No, as I said earlier in the tape, I went back to Hobson one time in 1996 when I was, 60-some years old, whatever that is. And anyway, probably closer to 70, and found one guy who had lived there. He had been younger than me, his brother. Everybody was dying of heart disease because they didn't ever think about taking care of themselves, and they rather live poorly in these little towns. They drink and they eat wrong and don't get any exercise and so on. But he was on his way out too, and he finally comes out of this really sort of a dark hole of a house, like a bear coming out of hibernation. Who's out here, Oh, boy, I think I remember you. But he was too young to have been there at the time, and I can't remember those other guys. What did we live in Hobson? 7 months.
Yeah.
Anyway, I might get back to Hobson for some reason I can't think of now. But I think what happened there was that my father could handle Montana. And he loved the open mountains and driving out across places. He liked being a circuit rider. And but my mother had gone back east, and even when she'd been to the University of Washington, she was, she was actually very, very bright. She was a history major and just loved history and philosophy and all the stuff related to that, and was a big hit with people that were really involved. And they got back there just before the Depression, and during those times there was very lively talk about economics and philosophy, and they actually had noted poets and stuff coming through the house, and it was a big lively time for her. And now they moved to this little dinky town in Montana, and somehow when they pulled into the town, she just broke down and cried. It was so desolate, and she took my younger brother was pretty young at that time and went to Chinook to stay with her folks for a while. And Barbara and my dad and I stayed in Hobson until she got ready to come back. But she always did her work. She was, cooked the meals and did the job and maintained her interests, but she needed more greater stimulation than that. I mean, she was way beyond that in her life pattern. But anyway, I think my dad must have said, okay, well, better get the family out of here, and moved north up to almost the Canadian border, up at a place called Sunburst that had 1,000 people. Might have had 2,000. I think they lied, though. And another big old open prairie area, but there were some not highly productive oil wells up in there, and they had built a refinery in Sunburst, and the people who were living high on the hog worked in the refinery and lived at one end of the town in company houses. But yeah, we moved up to Sunburst, and I got to think about Sunburst. And I turned off and think about Sunburst. What the heck can I say about Sunburst? Well, with regard to the Montana years, I don't know whether to kind of describe Montana or what, but here's a little more about Hobson, Move out there when I'm 12 years old, and pretty different place, of course, for Barbara and me. But, they call it the Big Sky Country. It's a great, huge, open place. I never thought much about the fact of the sky. I thought more about the openness of the ground. But in Hobson is almost in the middle of the state, a little north of the geographic center, and it is ringed with mountains. And there's a pass through there called Judith Gap. So there we are in the middle of the prairie in this little town. We could walk for miles and miles in any direction. Go all the way to the mountains, and wouldn't be much in between. I had, when we first went to Montana, we'd stopped in Chinook briefly at my grandparents' house. I walked upstairs and looked around, and there was this gun on a couple of coat hangers and a kind of a mirror fixture above a dresser in my grandfather's room. And I was pretty excited. When I was 12, I called my mother, hey, I think Grandpa would give me that gun. She went down and says, I sure would have that gun. He says, yeah. So that's where the 410 shotgun came from. And so I got some shells for it and had a chance to wander out in the prairies by myself anytime I wanted and shoot the gun. And a whole lot to shoot at. There's lots of gophers. I shot some gophers and maybe some snakes or something. But I don't know, just the idea of it for a 12-year-old kid first coming to Montana. But I kind of liked the openness, and it still appeals to me. That brown, endless openness. But here's a Hobson thing. December 7th, 1941. And I'd wandered out into the street, and some other kids, they had a Model T, kids my age and a little older. And I suppose there was 4 or 5 of them, of us. Anyway, whoever had this Model T, it was pretty much an engine with a cowl, and the rest of it was open. And whether it had ever been a truck or a car, I don't know, but the back of it was pretty much laid. It was just a barren laid out with some boards you could hop up on, like a bed of some kind. Rusty fenders and an open Model T. And they're trying to get it tuned up so it would go, They didn't have any generator on those. They'd have a magneto on them that would. In fact, it was kind of fun. They would always have fun with it. They'd set the magneto just ready to go when the pistons were exactly the right place. And every once in a while, You could turn on the turn on the ignition, and the thing would go spontaneously. No starter, no crank, no pushing. Trying to get the thing tuned up, and we pushed the thing up and down the dirt road. There's no other cars anywhere, just wide open, free. There's nobody on the street. And we'd get running along, and the thing would catch hold, and we'd all jump on and ride. Somebody'd be jockeying the spark and the choke levers, there on the steering column, the old Model T, and still trying to get it adjusted, and we were having a lot of fun. Just a clear winter day, clear sunny winter day, and I don't know if it was all that cold or not, but we were all comfortable. And some older teenager came walking along down the street, stopped us for a minute, and he says, the United States is at war. Well, back then we didn't know anything. I mean, we didn't have television, barely a newspaper. Occasionally you'd see a Life magazine with pictures of a horrible war going on in Europe or Asia. It didn't impinge on us at all. And he says, what do you mean? He says, well, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And we said, we barely knew who the Japanese were, and we had no idea what Pearl Harbor was. What's Pearl Harbor? He says, in Hawaii. Where is that? I mean, the isolation and the ignorance of foreign things in that place and time, kind of amazing, I suppose. Well, eventually we kind of dumbfounded by all this. He said, yeah, it's true. So we wandered home, each of us, and found out that it was true. And I started finding out about this stuff. At that moment, it didn't change my life, but I think I mentioned earlier in the tape that, that we were ready to move on from Hobson and moved up to the oil field town of Sunburst that I think I described, which is another big open place, not so ringed with the mountains. I don't even remember if you could see mountains from Sunburst. I don't think you could. Hard to think of a place in Montana where you couldn't, but it was really surrounded by even more of a wasteland. There were places that were almost without vegetation near it. And not too far away, Rimrock's place with these strange shaped rocks from the sandstone, I guess, from the wind blowing over many years and so on. But yeah, we moved up the oil fields, and now that began a different life, which I suppose I'll tell about when I think about it. Yeah, well, in Sunburst, I think there was 1,000 people there, so they like to say. They might have lied. One time I called it a town. Kids I knew jumped all over me and explained that it was a city. Fact is, there was a city not far away, maybe. You drove 40 miles, I think it was, 41 miles. You get south of Sunburst down to Shelby, and I think they had 2,000 people, and that was a city. If you went north of Sunburst, you came to the Canadian border in 8 miles. And, I don't know, let's see, what the heck. The beginning point for my case in Sunburst had to do with the fact that there are actually some other kids there, a little bit bigger, and a bunch of boys and girls my own age. Moved in there in the middle of the 7th grade and kind of got acquainted. And I think one thing about Sunburst is that with the oil people there, I might have been a little more used to trench, and so they all seem to be pretty permanent except for us, so I don't know about that. But it was just fun to for the first time that I could have remembered, have a whole bunch of friends my own age right there at hand. Boys and girls both. And didn't seem to matter a whole lot what we did, but town was pretty open. We used to go down to the railroads. There was an old old caboose and some boxcars down there and play around in that stuff. Caboose was a lot of fun. God, I don't know what the heck we did. I know that hadn't been too long into school, and a bunch of us just in the spring, every once in a while, we'd take a day off from school and just go tooling around out in the prairies and stuff. And so there was a lot of freedom there, actually. Quite a bit of freedom. I'm surprised my parents were so open and let us have all that freedom. They didn't seem to worry a whole heck of a lot, although what was there to worry about? I guess they could have got on the really case and clamped down about school and stuff like that, but I think we were doing okay anyway. Sunburst. God, what the heck do you say about Sunburst? Pretty good place in a lot of ways. Oh, my best friend was a guy named Mac McNally. And Mac's mother ran the railroad station. I don't imagine she would have if it hadn't been wartime, so the guy probably would have been running it, but she probably ran it better than anybody else. She was one of these people who could sit there and read a magazine and send Morse code out over the railroad wires in every direction, never miss a lick. Kind of a different kind of a Morse code, you know that. It's not like the buzzer type. It clicked like on a sounding board, and instead of being the length of the buzzes on a buzzer, it'd be the length of the pauses between the clicks. She'd been doing it for years, but she'd dispatch the trains. A lot of times the trains just go shooting through there, and she'd go out there with a great big wire hoop and hold it up, and the guy on the train would be stand out on the step and run his arm through the wire hoop, and it'd pull out of the handle with I don't know, dispatches or bits of paper on it and stuff like that, and just keep on going. But trains are a big thing in Montana. Of course, they'd stop sometimes if they needed to and pick up people and baggage and pick up stuff. And another thing Mac and me would do, we'd go down to the railroad station, and there's a great big old boardwalks out in front of it with these big old handled kind of baggage carts that were, I suppose, probably 10 feet long and about 3.5, maybe 2 or 3, I don't know, maybe 3 feet high, and big old steel wheels, and not that they were a whole lot of fun, but you could fool around with anything down there. Place where the train stopped had to pull in to get water, and a big old spout would pull down, and you could pull it down, just pour huge amounts of water if you wanted to, but it wasn't fun most of the time. I don't know, we could do a lot of stuff like that, but sometimes Mac and I got, it was a science class. It was kind of good. In the last half of 7th grade, we had general science. And one of the things they had in there, they had some sodium. Big old stick of sodium, about 4 or 5 inches long and about 1 inch in diameter, and the teachers show us how you could put it in water to just burn right down through and out the bottom of the pot. Thought that was pretty neat, so we'd sometimes sneak out of the house at night, go scale a short wall and break into the science room, take some sodium and go play with it. Eventually we took the whole stick. But it was, something exciting to be doing, I guess. So Mac and I did stuff like that. One time, Mac and I went for a hike, something like 7-8 miles down the open highway. Although on the way south down to Shelby, I guess it was, and cut into some friend's house, the Wise's house there it was, and they ran an oil lease. There's nothing growing out there in the barren prairie, but there were some oil wells punched out there, and they were all drilling some new ones. They were pretty short wells. But there were various kind of drilling rigs, and we go watch the guys, the roustabouts and stuff, running wells and stuff. But mostly it was just, nobody was drilling a well. The old wells were just out there pumping away with pump jacks. And our friends that ran what called a lease, actually, they saw to it that each of the wells was pumped a certain number of hours a day, and they'd be these long rods or sometimes cables running out from a big old wheel that ran horizontal in the middle of a big old shed. It was driven by a great big belt around it, and it would give the power to all these rods and cables that ran out in different directions of the pump jacks. Sometimes we'd just hop on the wheel and ride around for a while and then hop off and go out. And the kids that lived out there, mainly Billy Wise, happened to be there. Why, his job would be go out and maybe hook on some wells or hook off some if their time was on or off. But he wasn't there, and nobody was paying attention. So we were out among the oil wells, and just happened to come on one that looked like an old capped well, no more pump jack, but pipe barely sticking out of the ground, maybe something like 8 inches in diameter, and had a screw-on lid. Well, let's see if we can unscrew it. So we unscrewed it, and it's a little kind of a tin gasket cap inside of it, and let's take it off and look inside. So we did, and we thought, well, let's drop a rock down there. You know, these old oil wells, pretty much we thought, had heard, you know, they fill up with water. And so we dropped a rock down. After a long time, we heard the water splash. It wasn't like an oil splash, clearly water. So, well, that's interesting. You know, it's just water. Let's drop a match down. So we lit a match and dropped it down there. And next thing you know, there's an 8-inch diameter stack of blue flames sticking up in front of us. And, whoa, what about this, you know? I don't know. It seems now that it must have shot up sometime somewhere between 15, maybe 20 feet. I don't know. Holy Toledo, if we set the whole oil field on fire underneath the ground here, something like that. But we remembered our general science. And we thought, nah, there's no oxygen down there. It can't burn. So we weren't quite so scared anymore. We stuck back the piece of tin, screwed the lid on, felt a whole lot better about that. But sometimes I'd go out there. I'd actually stay with the Wises overnight. They had goats, and I'd milk the goats and stuff like that. But one thing, it was just Billy and I. He was 15. I was probably, he might have even been 16. I was 14 by then. And they had a tractor. And Bill had hooked the tractor onto a big old heavy sledge. It dragged her along the prairies, and we'd drag it around with that tractor. It's the first time I ever got to drive in a tractor, actually. Kind of liked it. And out on the oil fields there was heavy cast iron from the old days of steam boilers and all stuff like that. Stuff they just leave around when they drilled the wells and all that. And it was World War II time, and it was important to collect scrap metal because, I don't know, they needed it for some reason. They'd melt it up and make war supplies, I suppose. And anyway, he'd go around and collect that stuff to sell. It was one of the ways he made money. And that's one of the things we did, go around and collect, drive that thing around and collect heavy old metal. Well, I mentioned my friend Mac McNally, and the fact that his mom ran the railroad station. He never seemed to have any mention of his father, and I suppose maybe if his mother had ever been married, he probably didn't even know who it was anyway. But he was a very bright guy, you know, a good physical specimen, so on like that. But he was a very practical, worldly guy, and they lived in a hotel, and so. Long about time he turned 14, his mother thought it was time for him to have his own room down the hall, and he'd get his meals at the hotel and all that. So it's kind of the way Mac lived. He was kind of an adult in a sense, even as a kid. But he knew about gambling and poker and cards, and all the railroad men looked after Mac, but they also taught him all the earthy stuff that they knew. And he knew how to live in that sense, and learned a lot from him. And he started having poker games in his hotel room at night. Guys and girls would come over sometimes, and we'd play poker into the night. And took to smoking cigars. I liked Red Dot cigars. They had a good kind of honey flavor to them. I don't know why my parents were so open about everything, but they never seemed to worry about it. And we had a pretty good time. That was the nature of Mac. A couple times, for some reason or the other, Mac went to a church where my father was the minister, and sat through the services a couple times. And my father was no spellbinder. He didn't seem to have any idea about building a following, cadre of people behind him that just had to be a part of the whole thing. He's just a quiet man who liked to talk to people about things, and I always thought he was probably kind of boring. But I remember just out of the blue one time, sometime we were just walking somewhere and talking, and Max says, I'd really like to go to your father's church because he doesn't yell or harangue at you and all that. He says, he just talks to people, and he says, I like that. Well, Mac was an unusual guy. He in fact, everything showed a very bright but practical person, and he was not only one who followed what was going on in school, but definitely knew what was going on the outside too. Anyway, my dad decided to join the Army Air Corps. At least that's where they stuck him, was in the Army Air Corps, and as a chaplain, and so he had to go through all the processing and stuff like that, and become winter by then. And we had acquired a 1939 Ford by then. It was quite a nice gray sedan. I liked it. I mean, here it was only 43 maybe by then, I suppose. I don't know. Anyway, my mother had been asked to teach high school up on the Canadian border, 8 miles north in the town of Sweetgrass, because again, they lost teachers during the war and they needed somebody, and she had the background, and so, but she couldn't drive. So I'd drive her up there in the morning and then bring the car back down, go to school. Pretty snowy and cold, and one day I took her up there, and the snow was so deep I couldn't get up the hill to the school, but if she plowed with her boots up the steep front lawn of the school, she could walk up there through the drifts or through the piled snow. And so I let her off there, and she head on up to the school, and a janitor met her and said, hey, just in that short time, she says, your nose and ears and some part of your face are frozen. So he brought her into the little entryway there where there's no heat, and they would rub snow on all those parts, to make sure that was the way they treated frostbite then. She went on in, taught for the day, and I drove the car on down the 8 miles back and went to school. And I was in 8th grade by then, but that was just one of the jobs. Eventually, by the time summer had come, my dad was ready and processed, and we bailed out of Sunburst, and well, they did. I was working on a farm by then up on the Canadian border. Used to drive a tractor that I actually plowed the Canadian border. It was a field that belonged to the guy I worked for. Anyway, I worked on that farm for the summer, and then just before school started, I did the Montana thing. Left, went down to the town, so in the morning I could hop on the train and go to Chinook, where my mother and brother and sister had moved into an apartment in the same town my grandparents lived. But I thought, what the heck, Well, it was kind of a funny thing. That night I stopped for dinner and stay in the hotel that night. I'd give them $1 or $2 for a room. That's what it cost. Nobody ever treated me like a kid in a hotel or the restaurant or the trains or anything like that. I guess they just figured you were an adult when you were 14 or something. Anyway, I'd go in and get my Montana dinner and go into the old Montana hotel, where you walk up the narrow flight of old carpeted stairs to some room up there that's a room with a bed and a transom over the door and a window, and down the hall there was a room with a bathtub and another room, for toilet and sinks and stuff like that. Everything was silver dollars. I'd plunk down a couple silver dollars and get my room. Eat down in the bar cafe. They'd have sold me anything I wanted, but I just wanted to get my dinner was all. Good old Montana breakfast in the morning, and then on the train, head south to Shelby, change trains, and decided halfway to Chinook that I'd stop in the big town of Havre just for the heck of it and spend the night there. So same old thing, you know. Get a room for the night, have dinner at the hotel and breakfast in the morning, kind of wander around the great city of Havre. God, it must have been a big town. I bet they had 4,000 people in that town, and I met some other guy, and we had some fun the night. In the morning, I hopped on the train, went the rest of the way to Chinook, and that was kind of the beginning of the days when I was always trying to track down where the heck, see if I could find out where my parents live now. And, you know, I asked around town or whatever. And they lived in a duplex. I'd never heard of a duplex, but sure enough, there was my mom and sister and brother. And, of course, my dad was off someplace in the Army Air Corps. One time he came home. Well, more than once, but kind of a surprise. He gets off the train, comes up the door, the house, and he's carrying this thing, you know, with a red handle on it. And turned out it's his parachute, because he had to have a parachute to catch a ride home on a B-25. And the guy at the baggage place at the train station said, "Oh, is this red handle where you pick it up?" He said, "No, that's the rip card. Don't do that." He got this uniform with these ribbons on it and everything, because he was in World War I stuff. And they always give you a pot full of ribbons for this and that, anything, but he had the hat with a 20 mission crush where the earphones go and everything like that. And people thought he was pretty sharp looking. They thought that was very pretty. See this guy in this Air Force officer's uniform and all the pretty ribbons and stuff and a parachute. He was still off in the war thing out here. Lived in Chinook for a while. I'm going to dwell on Chinook right now. We spent the whole school year there. And I guess I'd say in general it was a good place, but never had quite the fun connection with kids and stuff that I had in Sunburst. For me, those were a year and a half in Sunburst was something I never experienced. And just having friends. Chinook, I guess maybe by the time you're in high school, people's relationships are formed, and you're maybe just the usual stranger that's come through in a town that's pretty static. But, you know, I knew some guys, but there was nothing wrong with Chinook. It was a good town. But at the moment, nothing that I want to say about it stands out. Oh, there was a river there, and so in the summertime, not that we were there much of the summer, there was a place to swim. That's something you didn't find in Hobson or Sunburst. And you could even go skating at night if it wasn't too bloody cold. Not too often happening, but it did happen. From school out, my dad had been sent to a little airstrip down the desert by Palm Springs, which wasn't then what I guess it is now, I heard, but Palm Springs now, there was a place. What a change of pace that was for us. This was a whole really new life. I remember my dad came up and met us up out of Palm Springs in a really hot place. I don't know, town Coachella or something like that. Anyway, so we get in the car. He'd come up and get us in an Army staff car, and we'd pile in the car off after a long, long trip on the train, where there was nothing room but to stand most of the time because the war had every train full of everything. We'd been there a long time getting down that far. Mother and sister and brother and dog in a baggage car, and we all got in the car. And then you drop down into the desert. We thought it was hot up above. It was 110 degrees down there. But a big old sandy desert. But there were resort places there. The hotels just weren't the magnitude that they are today. And he'd gotten a house to live in. And there were a lot of houses sitting out there in the desert. And people didn't use all the water in the world then to have green lawns in the desert and all that. The lawns were, yards were sand, and house was very simple, no heat. In fact, didn't even have a typical hot water heater. Somebody heat up the coils or something while you're using the water. But I got a job working in a resort hotel, I guess. And instead of driving a tractor around the fields, I was up in a palm tree whacking off the palm leaves that make a beard around there, sitting up there 20 feet in the air, trying to stay off the pointy little pieces in the palm and stuff like that. But then you could use the swimming pool at the resort hotel. Beyond that, the Army had taken over these, what now we think of as very simple resort hotels, but they weren't simple then. And the officers' club and officers' quarters and stuff like that, you go out and use the swimming pools out there. And gosh, you know, when the rest of the world was suffering and the rest of the nation, everything was rationed. It was hard to get beef, maybe. It was hard to get, you couldn't get chocolate. Well, at the PX, you get everything. So we pretty much had the run of things, and between the resort hotels I worked in the officers' clubs and officers' quarters, once again, there's an incredible wild freedom with all kind of good stuff to do, and I just loved all the airplanes coming and going. And, you know, we had the run to going out on the base when we wanted to and just watch things happening. But one time, would love to do this again. Not too far down the street from where we lived, we were walking toward the mountains. Mount San Jacinto rose straight up off the desert floor at about 4:30 in the afternoon, I guess. Even in the summer, while the sun would disappear in the desert, you'd get cool, because San Jacinto was reputed to be the highest direct rise from Florida summit in the world, and shielded the town from the blistering desert summer sun. Anyway, my mother and brother and sister and I were walking down that direction, not too far to the mountain, actually, from my house. About halfway there was this place that said milkshakes. Date milkshakes. That was a good place. They grew dates there in that area. So we had a little bit of money, which we never had before. And she said, let's go in and get each a milkshake. And we went into this place, and we each got a date milkshake. And it's still, I think, maybe one of the most wonderful things I've ever tasted in my life. But there were a lot of good things like that. We could eat wonderful food at the officers' mess, the officers' club. And if you went a little farther toward the mountains, which Barbara and I and friends often did, yeah, we've had some friends there. That's another neat thing. And other transients like us, so we'd get along. Anyway, there's an open canyon up into the mountain. The mountain. It was called Takit's Canyon, or Devil's Canyon. And you'd step in there, and it was cool and different. There were palm trees growing in there. You walk up there, and the water fell from the top of Mount San Jacinto, and there wasn't any ski run or anything up there in those days. It was just an empty mountaintop way up above you. And the melting snow would just pour this cascading water down. And we'd go to a waterfall there that had been hitting fit for so many years. There were giant rounded boulders that you yep on top of, and a great big surging, utterly clear pool below it. And you could dive into that ice cold water and just kind of drift out of it and go and climb up and do the whole thing over again. There was never, ever anybody up there but us kids that would go up there, and maybe just ourselves. Wonderful, big old, beautiful, clear water, empty place that we just love to go. I hope it's still there and undisturbed, but I just likely. Palm Springs School was a good thing. Went to high school there, and it was such an open, friendly place. All the lockers were outside because it never rained. There was a little porch-like thing along the edge of the high school rooms. You always went outside. There were no hallways, just from room to room. They didn't need any, and played volleyball outside, and the whole shot was just an outside thing. But again, everybody accepted everybody. There were multi-millionaires, kids, and kids from the Mexican jungle out in the desert, and us military transients and everything. And the level of acceptance of everybody was absolutely incredible. It was just a wonderful school to go to. We enjoyed every bit of it. But of course, the military keeps moving people on, and Dad got sent to Memphis, Tennessee, which was the antithesis of that. And the school was a horrible, big old brick building where nobody cared about anybody, and they didn't know who you were, didn't care who you were. Everything was cut and dried. They knew what they wanted. And they didn't have a whole lot of use for us transients anyway. Hardly met a soul there, didn't have a friend. Had a neighbor kid, though, that I got to know, and that was good. We had bicycles. And he and I had, his name was J.D. Gresham. And we had the old balloon-tired one-speed bikes, and we'd hop on them night or day, whenever, weekend or night, and ride down into wonderful downtown Memphis. And the way we'd do it is we'd wait till a bus or truck had come by. We'd grab hold on our bicycles and just go wheeling away at the speed of traffic down into downtown Memphis and fool around down there. And another good thing, like when Barbara and I had come home from school, you rode actually city buses, and sometimes we'd stop at it was a farmer's market down there in the middle of downtown Memphis. Go down there, and they had a machine that automatically made donuts. And sometimes we had a little bit of money, we'd buy one of those donuts, and that was one of the great things. But the school year went on. It was a hellish thing. And but when summer came, my dad had gotten both of his jobs out on the air base. Now, that was an exciting place. World War II in Europe had ended, and they were bringing home the old war where you shot up bombers and fighter planes and stuff like that. And all that activity going on. And she got a job at a place called Priorities in Traffic there. But I got the job that every teenager in town wanted, but they couldn't get it because I had a connection. Myself and two other guys had the only Jeeps that could run out on the flight lines. We could cross the runways, and we could cross the taxi strips and drive on the tarmac and give rides to the pilot. And we had banners on our Jeeps that allowed us to go there. Red and yellow banners diagonal on our square flags. Nobody cared much. We just zap around in these Jeeps and deliver the messages and head back to the hangar where we had our base offices there and talk to the guys that had come back from the China, Burma, India theater and stuff like that. And we just all having a good time, buddies. And they'd send me the PX to get ice cream. And one time I went out in the hangar on a hot, muggy summer Memphis day. There's a Coke machine out there where people used to go out and get these nickel bottles of Coke all the time. I think I'll try that. So I stuck a nickel in, and I drank this bottle of Coke, and I thought, my God, that stuff is good. Whoa! It was like an elixir of some kind. No wonder those people drink that stuff. I don't know if it was different in those days, or if it was just a hot day, and I got some cold beverage and some caffeine. And I've heard in the South they used to still have cocaine in them, but I doubt that that was true. Dang, I forgot what I did with my money when I was working on the airbase. My dad thought I had to take flying lessons down at little Memphis sod runway flying place. They could now allow airplanes to fly around because the people back there didn't worry about the war in Asia. They barely knew what was going on, and they could fly again down there. And I started taking lessons in these little old flivver airplanes. They had mostly, as far as I remember, had mostly tandem Piper Cubs. There might have been a Taylorcraft or something mixed in there somewhere. That was kind of fun to go up and tool around. We'd do spins and stalls and stuff. And I wanted finished. Why? Of course, we moved again, and so I didn't get my solo permit yet, but sure had a lot of fun flying those little planes around. Especially like to do spins and stalls. That was the best part for me. Sometimes you'd fly down over the traffic, and even then from an airplane it sure did look crazy. That's all I got to say about traffic from an airplane. I thought those people down there on the road were sure as heck kill themselves. They didn't seem to know when they were swerving, when they were going straight ahead. But anyway, that was another good thing about Memphis, was taking flying lessons. I liked was I got to go up on a C-47 one time. Some pilots who were doing a flight check. They said if you hop on the airplane when you go up to do the flight check, we don't know about it. It's not our fault. And you show up in the cockpit later, there ain't nothing we can do about it. So come up and see us. So I did, and we had a wonderful lazy flight down over the winding Mississippi River for many, many miles. That was a good flight. And I don't know if it was my first ride in an airplane, or if my first flight in an airplane was one of the flying lesson planes that I was in when I was taking lessons down there in that little sod runway place in Memphis.